888-318-7884, the number. Aaron in Hastings, Michigan, watching on YouTube. Aaron, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Joe.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for taking my call.
Happy to.
Yeah, thanks for calling.
My question is, what proof do we have that Mary remained virgin?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I want to, if I may, I'm going to give a little bit of a longer answer to this because I want to anticipate a few verses that get regularly thrown around that seem like they're saying the opposite. That seem like they're saying Mary had other children. So one is you've got a couple passages that refer to Jesus's brothers, and we're even told the name of a couple of people who are called Jesus's brothers. So, for instance, James and Joseph are mentioned by St. Mark as brothers of our Lord. But then you go later on when you read the account of the crucifixion, and Mark mentions that this same James and Joseph are the son of another Mary, and that appears to be Mary, the wife of Clopas. Now, if you want to go really deep on this, Clopas, we're told by a 2nd century source named Hegesippus, is the uncle of Jesus, and also seems to have been married to a woman named Mary. And this would mean that James and Joseph aren't Jesus's literal brothers, but are actually cousins. Now, you don't have to take that, but you don't have to believe Hegesippus. But however you make sense of the evidence, you have to realize that these people called brothers of Jesus have a different mother, and obviously they don't share the same father since Jesus doesn't have a biological father. So then it's like, okay, what do we make of all of that? Well, brother is used in a much more flexible way because there isn't a Hebrew word for cousin, for nephew, for uncle. And so Abraham and Lot, for instance, in Genesis, are referred to as brothers. We know they're uncle, nephew. And so brother in this sense should be understood just as kinsman. So that's not a really solid argument against Mary's perpetual virginity. The second one that actually I think backfires is people will point out in Matthew 1, it says that Mary remains a virgin until Jesus is born. And people say, well, it doesn't logically entail that therefore she wasn't a virgin afterwards. And here I would say that this is just a misreading of the text. And I'd say this for a couple of reasons. First, because we're also told in the New Testament that Christ will reign until he's put his enemies under his feet. That's 1 Corinthians 15, verse 25. That doesn't mean Christ is going to stop reigning after his triumph. So until doesn't mean up to this point and not after. It just means up to this point. If I say the music was blaring from the time I got to the party until I left, I'm not saying that they turned the music down as soon as I walked out the door. I'm just demarcating a start and an end point in time. And so then you say, okay, well, why would Matthew be doing that in Matthew 1? In other words, if Matthew's not trying to tell us that Mary had sexual relationships with Joseph after Christmas, why did he say this at all? And Matthew tells us in Matthew 1. He tells us in verse 23 that this is to show the fulfillment of Isaiah 7, which says that a virgin will conceive and bear a child. So if Mary had sexual relationships with Joseph, even though he's her husband, the prophecy wouldn't have been fulfilled because a virgin would have conceived a child, but a virgin wouldn't have borne the child. This is a fitting issue to deal with since I'm waiting any day now for my wife to give birth. Bearing a child is an event that happens about 9 months after conceiving a child. So childbirth is like Isaiah 7 points to 2 moments. There's going to be a virgin conception and virgin childbirth. And so Matthew is telling us that Mary is a virgin at both of these moments. He's not trying to tell us, and then she stopped being a virgin. That is just not true. Rather, I think a couple things are worth noting here. First, we should be wondering, like, why in the world is Mary a virgin when she's giving birth? The angel doesn't tell her she needs to be a virgin. And in fact, Joseph is referred to as her husband. I know some translations will say they're just betrothed or engaged, but under Jewish law, there were 2 stages to a wedding, and they were legally married, which is why Joseph contemplates divorce. They could have had sexual relations with each other. We know this in part because Jesus goes into the temple and people just assumed this was the child of Joseph and Mary. If he'd been born out of wedlock, he wouldn't have been allowed in the temple under Mosaic law. So the arguments we should be asking are, why is Mary a virgin when the angel Gabriel comes to her when she's legally married? And then they actually move in together. They live together, which is the second stage of a Jewish wedding. And still Mary's a virgin. But all of that is just sort of suggestive. I think the single clearest piece of evidence is in John 19. At the foot of the cross, Jesus entrusts Mary to the disciple John, a non-relative. So this is a famous woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. And this would be absolutely unthinkable if Mary had other children. That if Mary had children she could go and live with, she would have had not only the right to do so, her children have an obligation under the 10 Commandments. When it says honor your father and mother, this was understood to mean you have to take care of them in their old age. And in fact, the New Testament tells you if you don't do that, you're worse than an unbeliever. And so the idea that Jesus would disrespect his own family at the cross like that by not allowing them to honor their mother is unthinkable. So that's very clear evidence, I would say, of the fact that there are no biological children of Mary other than the one who's dying on the cross right there.